I found a hidden camera inside the Airbnb me and my wife was staying in. As soon as we arrived at the Airbnb, we knew it was going to be an unforgettable weekend. It was just the kind of getaway we needed, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The rustic cabin sat at the edge of a forest, a perfect blend of cozy charm and modern amenities. The pictures on the website didn't do it justice. It was even more beautiful in person. My wife, Emily, was ecstatic. She'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. After months of juggling work stress and life's constant demands, we finally had time to ourselves. No distractions, no interruptions. Just the two of us. She smiled at me, her eyes sparkling in the fading evening light. "This is perfect," she said softly, stepping into the cabin, her hand brushing against mine. The place was everything we wanted. A small, warm living room with a fireplace, a kitchen stocked with essentials, and a large bedroom with a king-sized bed that looked irresistibly inviting. We quickly unpacked and settled in. Emily was already thinking about what we'd cook for dinner while I lit the fireplace, casting a soft amber glow across the room. After a hearty meal, we decided to relax on the couch. The fire crackled, filling the air with the scent of burning wood, and the world outside was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. We wrapped ourselves in a blanket, wine glasses in hand, reminiscing about how long it had been since we had a moment like this. It felt right, like everything was falling into place. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew more intimate. I could feel the tension building between us, the kind of tension that leads to those unforgettable moments where time seems to stop. Emily leaned in closer, her lips brushing against my neck as she whispered, "Why don't we take this to the bedroom?" I didn't need any more convincing. The excitement in her voice sent a shiver down my spine. We stood up, hand in hand, and made our way to the bedroom. The room was softly lit, the bed inviting, the air thick with anticipation. The night was ours, and it felt like nothing could ruin it. But then something caught my eye. It was just a small, blinking red light. At first I thought it might be some kind of security device, but it was positioned oddly, tucked in the corner of the room, facing directly at the bed. A cold chill ran through me. My first instinct was to ignore it, to focus on Emily, who was already starting to undress, her body silhouetted against the dim light. But that little light wouldn't let me. "Babe, wait," I said, my voice a bit more urgent than I intended. "What's that?" Emily paused, turning to look at where I was pointing. She squinted, confusion crossing her face as she stepped closer to the corner. The air seemed to shift, the warmth between us replaced by something colder, something uneasy. "It's just a light, right?" she said, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. I wasn't so sure. I grabbed a chair and stood up to get a closer look. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached up and ran my fingers along the edge of the small device. It wasn't just a light. "It's a camera," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Emily's eyes widened in shock. "What do you mean, a camera?" "There's a hidden camera in the room," I repeated, the words heavy on my tongue. My pulse raced as the reality of the situation sank in. Someone had been watching us, maybe for hours, maybe longer. The thought made my stomach turn. I pulled the camera down, holding it in my hands, and stared at it like it was some kind of alien device. "Who would do something like this?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. The romantic night we'd been planning evaporated in an instant, replaced by a sickening feeling of invasion. Someone had violated our privacy, and it felt like the walls were closing in on us. I walked to the living room, camera still in hand, my mind racing. What else had been recorded? Had they been watching us since we arrived? Were there more cameras hidden around the cabin? My imagination ran wild, fueled by the silence around us. I could see the fear in Emily's eyes, and I felt the same unease gnawing at me. "I'm going to check the rest of the house," I said, my voice low as I began moving from room to room, my eyes scanning every corner, every shelf, every crack in the walls. The thought of someone watching us through that camera, of us being so vulnerable and exposed, was unbearable. There was nothing else, no other devices, no other signs of surveillance. But the damage had been done. The cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary, it felt like a trap. Emily stood in the center of the room, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face pale. "We need to leave," she said softly, her voice cracking. She was right. I nodded and grabbed our bags, quickly packing up our things. The warmth, the fun we had anticipated, was gone. There was no time to waste, we just needed to get out of there. But as I started to gather our belongings, a strange noise broke the silence. A faint electronic beeping sound. "What's that?" Emily asked, her voice tight with fear. I froze, listening closely. The sound was coming from the small device in my hand. I looked down at it. The camera. It was still active. My blood ran cold. I hadn't turned it off, and that beeping, it was connected to something. A horrible thought struck me. Someone was watching us live. I immediately tore the battery out of the camera, my hands shaking. The beeping stopped, but the sense of dread didn't. It was all too much, too surreal. We needed to get out of there, and fast. As we rushed to the door, I couldn't help but glance around one last time, scanning the cabin with new eyes. Everything looked so normal, but now it all seemed tainted, sinister even. The place that had once felt like the perfect romantic escape was now something straight out of a nightmare. We jumped into the car, the tension between us palpable. The drive back to the city was quiet, both of us too shaken to talk. The cabin faded into the distance, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Emily's hand found mine, squeezing tightly. I could feel her fear, her confusion, and I felt guilty for not noticing sooner. Back at home, we sat in silence for what felt like hours. The warmth of our apartment felt foreign now, as if the events of the night had somehow followed us. Emily curled up next to me on the couch, her head resting on my shoulder. We were safe, but the sense of violation was still too fresh. "What do we do now?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm calling the police. They need to know." I grabbed my phone and dialed the local authorities, explaining everything that had happened. The officer on the other end sounded concerned, telling me that they'd send someone over to collect the evidence. As I hung up, I glanced at Emily. She was still trembling, her eyes filled with an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. "It's going to be okay," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it myself. Later that night, we lay in bed, the familiar comfort of our home offering little solace. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak, every shadow made me wonder if there was still someone out there watching. Emily held onto me tightly, as if letting go would mean falling back into that nightmare. "I'm sorry," I whispered into her hair, guilt gnawing at me. "I should have been more careful." "It's not your fault," she replied softly. "We couldn't have known." The words were meant to comfort, but they didn't do much to erase the lingering fear. I couldn't shake the thought that we'd been so close to something terrible. Who knows how long that camera had been there, or how many other guests had been recorded without their knowledge. Days passed, and eventually the police got back to us. They informed us that the camera was part of a larger investigation into a network of hidden surveillance devices placed in various vacation rentals in the area. It was a disturbing revelation, one that made my skin crawl. Emily and I tried to move on, to put the experience behind us, but it wasn't easy. The trust we had in the safety of our private moments was shattered. Even though we were back home, I found myself double-checking every room, every corner for hidden devices. The paranoia lingered, a shadow that followed us everywhere. In time, things started to get better. We talked about it, worked through the fear, and slowly we began to feel like ourselves again. But that weekend was something we'd never forget. The romantic getaway that turned into a nightmare. The camera that reminded us just how fragile privacy can be. It left a mark on us, a story we'd tell for years to come. But for now, the story wasn't over. The investigation was still ongoing, and while we were safe, the thought that someone out there had seen us in our most vulnerable moments continued to haunt me. I held Emily close, grateful that we had each other. Whatever came next, we'd face it together.